Hi, everyone. I am getting folks added to the room. Okay. We had a lot of people register for the talk, and I'm not sure how many people registered so that they could join us live versus being able to join us or being able to catch the replay. So I'm going to give just a minute or two more for people to come in. And while I'm monitoring that, I'm gonna let Annalise tell you how to change your settings so that you can be on active speaker mode so that you can see whoever's talking.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Annalise. So if you want to, as opposed to looking at us all in this little grid that you might see us now, depending on the device you're on, if you tap on your screen or you hover over to a button that says switch to active speaker mode, you'll be able to just see whoever is speaking, taking up your main screen. It's a little less of a overwhelming image for some folks. So I know I'll have that on while I'm talking and participating today. So just a suggestion to make it a little less of a barrage of faces.
Another thing I would say is feel free to use the chat. I'm going to try and keep an eye on it. I am not a skilled moderator, so things might get lost. If we have some time at the end, I do want to open it up for questions. You know, or if we find that there's a good spot and things are really popping off over there, Annalise or Emily, feel free to nab a question if you see it. It's a lot of fun to see familiar faces coming in. It's really fun. This is my first time doing an event on Zoom like this, rather than doing an Instagram live, and it feels great to have other people's faces and not just be working on a teeny tiny computer screen, and to have some really exciting guests joining us today. I'm actually going to introduce Emily and Annalise here. Am I saying your name right, Annalise? Yeah, good. Just checking. Okay, so Emily is local to me here in Portland. She's a fiber artist. She's a dyer. She does naturally hand-dyed yarns, and she only dyes non-superwash yarns. And she has a gorgeous eye for color. All of her yarns seem to me like they would be perfect together. Let's see. She uses merino and rambouillet. Emily, am I saying that right? Nope, you're muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Yeah, it's actually just merino rambouillet crossbreed.
Rambouillet. Okay, yeah, great. Yeah, and you do all your own sourcing of plant materials, or supplement your plant sourcing materials, or I know you do a lot of it yourself.
So I grow about 12 different dye plants in my backyard.
Wow.
And I also source from a local natural dyer in Portland. She lives in North Portland, and I like literally drive to her house and get stuff from her and ask lots of questions. So I feel very fortunate to have someone in my backyard that is that knows as much as she does. She's been doing it for like 50 years. So between that and my garden, I can get lots of colors.
That's really super cool. And I know that you're going to talk about this more later, but the wool that you use is sourced from sheep that are all responsibly raised and treated with a progressive approach to land management. And I know that we'll talk about that a lot more.
Yeah.
I asked Annalise if she would join this talk tonight because she is a knitter, and I don't feel like we hear enough from knitters in conversations like this. And, you know, I have been in Annalise's community on Instagram for long enough to see some of the really cool content she's been putting out there, advocating for non-superwash yarns and wearing them and, you know, knitting with them all the time. And I think that sort of advocacy from a knitter's perspective is something that's a little extra special in our community. And I wanted to have her be able to share with us. Okay.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah. So So I am just gonna do one more thing here. We should be good to go.
Cool.
All right. Okay, so my plan for the format of this is I have some things that I'm hoping that we can talk about. And so I'm going to try and guide the conversation. But most of the learning here is going to take place from the things that Emily and Annalise share with us. And Emily, Annalise, I might direct a question to one of you or the other, but we'll leave lots of time for everybody to contribute. And I'm sure it'll happen the way it's supposed to. It'll unfold perfectly. So Emily is a natural dyer who only dyes non-superwash yarns.
Yeah.
For people who are new to this conversation about non-superwash, superwash yarns, can you tell us a little bit about the manufacturing differences between the two?
Yeah. So non-superwash is a process where they it's meant to make the wool resistant to shrinking and felting. And there are a couple ways to do it. There's the one is a subtractive method. And so they'll use like chlorine or chlorinated gases to help strip or partially remove the outer coating or the scales of a yarn. And then the other one is more popular, and this is an additive version where they will coat the strands of the hair with polymers or with silicone softeners. And then in some cases, they'll actually do both. They'll strip part of the scales of the wool. Excuse me, I'm a little nervous. And then because it makes the fiber smaller, actually, then they'll go and add the polymers to kind of add back to the hair shaft. And it makes it, when they do both, it's really, really, really silky smooth. So of course, those have environmental implications. And if you really want to know like the chemical level of what's going on, there's this really great podcast that I listen to that goes super in depth and has side-by-side comparison pictures of what the yarn looks like before and after it's been treated. And that's by Miriam Felton, and it's called Yarn Stories. And she actually interviews someone from Chargers, which is a plant in South Carolina. But anyway, what I wanted to talk about, I'm sorry, I've got to look at my notes. There is a more ecological friendly version of superwash that is becoming more available. And that is, instead of using polymers or silicone softeners to coat the yarn, they actually can use the byproduct of other methods or like collagen and keratin to coat the yarn instead. So that's the superwash process. It's hard to tell if something is done with that process. I feel like I've seen a yarn label once or twice that actually said eco-friendly superwash process. And then non-superwash, of course, is, it hasn't been treated chemically at all. So what's nice about that is that the fibers can still have kind of like this, they'll get like a fulling effect because they can still rub against each other slightly, but they will of course felt because any agitation will irritate them and make them, the little barbs come together.
Yeah, whenever people talk about the scales on yarn, I honestly imagine like a bag of snakes that are all like sticking to each other like Velcro. So yeah, that's what I'm imagining. I know that people talk about O-wash yarn as being like a more sustainably manufactured superwash, but I've had people in my DMs this week saying, I understand that like all superwash is like shipped overseas to be processed. And I think that there's, one of the things that we'll talk more about later is I think that there's just so much like nuance and like misinformation and mystery behind how things are made. And I think that that's something that is frustrating for people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Thank you for giving us the lowdown, because I did not know anything about keratin or collagen being alternatives. I figured, because I've heard like some forms are better than others. I was like, okay, I guess the stripping kind is better, but chlorine gas does not sound better. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I know, for instance, so when I listened to that podcast about chargers, they actually they're a big enough facility that they have a filtration system on site. So the chlorine that they use in the process never goes into the water supply. So that's really great. But, I don't know how many plants in the world that are doing this sort of process that are not getting rid of those chemicals responsibly. So
Yeah.
it's up to us to ask questions and pressure people to have that information really available.
Yeah,
Make good
definitely.
decisions. Yeah.
And Annalise, you're like a vocal advocate for knitting with non-superwash.
A ranter, some might say.
But like a non-judgy ranter. One of the things I really love about your approach is you're like, hey, this is something you could choose to do. So, I want you to get credit for being a healthy ranter. Can you share some of your like experiences with knitting with non-superwash? Like, why do you love your finished objects that are knit with non-superwash so much? What's special about them?
So I think for me, really what, taking into account the thoughtful considerations Emily raised about the ecological concerns and the, waste disposal concerns, those are really important to me. And that's kind of the backdrop through which I came to my non-superwash advocacy journey. But really, I appreciate your question in that the finished products are very different. Knitting with a non-superwash wool is going to get you a really different finished effect than knitting with a superwash wool. I think the biggest difference why I prefer a non-superwash garment and why I'm drawn to knitting with that fiber, and really we're talking about wool here. Like I have heard that other animal fibers can be superwash, but like when we talk about superwash versus non, we're really talking about wool, right? And so when you think about a superwash wool, like as Emily pointed out, the fibers being coated, and that results in a really different drape, a really different hand feel. And naturally, when something is, a lot silkier, smoother, and is, the fibers are really flowing across each other, you're going to get a much slipperier, drapier finished product. On the, looking at a non-superwash wool, the fiber is going to grip onto itself a little bit more firmly, and you're going to get a garment, speaking very generally, that has a little more structure, right? So I think maybe I gravitate more toward like a boxier or a wardrobe that has a bit more of that maybe drape, that honestly maybe mirrors a little bit more like a woven fabric, right? You think about like linens or cottons that are woven, they have a bit of structure, they stand up a bit. I find that non-superwash wool, when knitted up, obviously totally depends on the fiber, totally depends on the maker. It does have a little bit more of that fabric quality that's kind of maybe more like a woven fabric. That still has drape, of course, and flow, and you can have beautiful fluid. I have some wonderful non-superwash different blends of animal fibers in my closet that are quite drapey, but I think that's the key difference for me, is that fluidity and drape. When you make a superwash sweater, it's going to have a lot more flow. It's going to be a lot slipperier. It's going to just be, it's a weird word, but it's going to wiggle more because those fibers are not, tacking onto each other when they're moving. Whereas with a non-superwash wool, you do get a bit more of that grip. So that's like really granular, but that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I think about, so my role in this is a designer. I did not introduce myself, but I design patterns, knitting patterns, and I mostly design garments. I'm a garment knitter mostly, so that's mostly what I design. Mm-hmm. And one of the conversations I've been having with my peer group is, can you make a size inclusive sweater in superwash? Because the weight of that sweater stretches so much. How do you build enough structure into a garment so that it is the same sweater the first time you wear it and the 40th time you wear it if you're knitting with superwash?
Such a good point. Really, really good, really important point.
I have another question that either of you know the answer to. So somebody DM'd me and they were like, I prefer superwash because it doesn't pill. And like, I felt shocked because I have been moving away from superwash merino because I feel like it pills so bad. So is that just because it's merino, do you think? Or what's been your experience as a knitter with non-superwash yarns, do you find that they pill more?
Well, I want Emily to weigh in on this, but it's so funny you say that, Jen, because I had this exact same, I think I posted it in my stories a few months ago. Like, wait, like the one superwash sweater I made myself last fall that I wear seems to have pilled wildly more than any of the other non-superwash sweaters I wear, which I wear all the time. And then someone in my DMs had suggested that it has to do with the ply.
Mm-hmm.
So a superwash yarn with a really high twist, a really, multiple plies might pill less. Whereas like, this actually, maybe you and I were talking about it, like the singular, the closer you are in the single ply direction, the more it's going to pill.
Yeah.
But I also totally anecdotally, it seems like superwash does pill just as much, if not more, but my sample size is so small. So Emily, you're more equipped to answer this.
You know what? I actually don't know the answer, but I think you hit a nail on the head, Annalise, is that like single ply for sure. It doesn't have as much twist. So that is definitely gonna rub, and those fibers are gonna find each other. And especially I think stuff in like the super fine to fine category, like merino and anything in the lower micron range, which I'm totally going to get into, by the way. I think those fibers are just really fine, and it makes sense that those would pill more easily. Whereas if you have something that's more coarse hair, it's definitely going to have some structure and it's going to bind together, and maybe the crimp has something to do with it as well.
Yeah, maybe crimp, staple length, and twist.
Staple, yeah, I was gonna say staple length too. I wonder if like a Rambouillet, which is like, super soft, super, that like it might react differently than like a more coarse fiber.
Yeah. Well, if anybody in the chat knows the answer or has a hot take, slip it in there. I'll be looking out. And Emily, I love that you set us up for the next thing I want to talk about, which is soft and scratchy, right? So I talk a lot about having sensory issues. There's very little I can wear against the skin, even in ready to wear. And for a long time, I avoided anything but superwash because I thought it was necessarily scratchy, right? It was going to be scratchy. It was going to be woolly. I wasn't going to be able to wear it. This is non-superwash, and I wear it on my neck, and I wear it there all day. So, or I've been working on a sweater that's in a whole sweater against my whole body for next to the skin wear, and it's absolutely butter soft. It's 4-ply, it's 100% merino, non-superwash, and it's from Kelsey, who I know is in the room. And so, yeah, and I'll try and put together some notes so that people can find things later. So in my mind, I was like, okay, 4-ply, maybe because it's a rounder fiber, it's less scratchy. And then I was like, but that doesn't always seem to be the case. And then I was thinking of like, like I'll go into a store and I'll be like, can I tolerate this? And I'll go home, and of course I can't, even though in the store it seems so soft. And I think mohair is like a classic example, right? Like we've all been like, oh, this is going to be so soft. I think everybody's first experience with mohair is like shock. You knit it up and it's totally unwearable against the skin. So what gives? How can we make better predictions? And for folks who don't have great availability in their yarn shop for these fibers, how can they make really well-informed decisions online? And Emily, if you want to tackle that one first.
Yeah, I've had so much fun researching yarn, and what all comes down to is the micron count of your fiber. So microns are a unit of measurement, and in this case, it's the diameter of the hair. So the lower the micron count, the thinner the hair, the softer it's going to be. And the reason that is that the thinner the hair, the smaller the scales. So if the scales are really small, there's less protrusion on your skin. So I'm looking at my notes right now because I have a lot of like little stats on here, and I think you're all going to take away so much good information from this right here. And you'll be able to look at a label and be like, that's the yarn for me, or no, I need to steer clear from that. So wool is graded, and it goes from super fine to fine. The source that I have been referring to mostly introduces fine crossbred, medium crossbred, and coarse. And, that it's just like a technical thing. But basically, I just wanted to give you a guideline of what microns mean when it comes to your skin. So let's start with superfine. You know what superfine is, like that's alpaca, right? You think of that. It's 19 microns and lower. Anything lower than 19 is going to be superfine. And then fine is between 20 and 24. Fine crossbred is 25 to 28. Medium crossbred is 29 to 32. And coarse would be 33 and higher. So not like you're going to memorize that, but this is all you need to remember right here. So if it's less than 20 microns, that means that it's virtually itch-free for every skin type. And if it's between 21 and 29, it's itch-free for most people, and that's between the fine and the medium category. And then when you hit 30, that's basically called the scratch factor. And that's it's considered scratchy to every skin type. So I'm going to break it down even further. So hold on to your butts. So when you're looking at labels and you're like, okay, that's great, Emily, you just told me about microns for sheep. What about other fibers? So to give you a point of reference, silk is 10 to 13, which is really, really, really low. And cashmere is 14 to 15 and a half. And then I'm going to talk about mohair. Like you brought that up, and I think that's really excellent that you brought that up. It ranges between 18 and 40. So you don't really know, like, is this mohair going to be soft or not, right? Baby alpaca is still in the superfine category. So that's 18 to 22 and a half. And then there's medium alpaca, which is from 23 to 30 microns. Did you know that baby alpaca does not mean it's from a baby alpaca?
I didn't until you told me. And after you told me, I was like, they're not out there in the field shaving baby alpacas. Well, okay. I guess that makes sense.
So that's just a classification, because so that's telling you that it's really low in the micron level. So if you're looking at a label and it says silk, baby alpaca, and merino, it should be really, really, really smooth. If you're like that small percentage of people that finds that any fiber is irritating on your skin, I would stick to those. And merino and rambouillet, because those are still in the superfine to fine category. And then I'm going to tell you one more really interesting thing about microns, and then I'll shut up. When I was researching yarns to or wool to make yarn, I actually went to a local rancher, and she had border lesters. And I didn't know anything about border lesters or what grade or how coarse that fiber was. And she let me get a yearling's fleece, which means like a year old fleece that meant it was going to be really, really soft. And it's luscious. It was beautiful. And I scoured it and I picked it and I sent it off to a mill. And I was talking to the owner of the mill, and I was like, so can we soften this up a bit? Can we just throw some merino in there and make it a little bit softer blend? And she's like, that is a very common misconception. You can't really just take something in the coarse category, like microns of like 30 microns, and then mix it with a 20 of merino, because your skin can tell the difference up to 4 microns. That means like if the micron level between those two fibers are greater than 4, your skin can feel it. And it will, it'll have an irritation like effect. So if you're seeing blends of yarns, it's usually something in like the same category as something. So maybe that's why like silk, alpaca, or baby alpaca and merino are always together, because they're in the same category micron level wise. And if you're going to do, I can see if you would want to take those two yarns and put them together because they have a great effect. Like maybe you want the softness and the crimp of the and the airiness of a merino, but then you want the luster from a border lester. then that would make sense. But you're not going to soften something that's already in the scratch zone. So.
I feel like you're telling me that if I have sand in my bed, it's not going to become less irritating if I add pillows, cushions, or yeah, I think that's really, really fascinating and helpful. How do we find out about microns?
That's a great question. I feel very fortunate because I actually talked to the owner of the company who speaks directly and works directly with the ranchers. So she knows the micron count of the yarn that I use, which is between a 20 and a 21, because she talks to them and they send it off to the lab and then they have the count. And so I know that fact. And maybe some other breeds do know that if they're getting it from like a single source or if it's a small sample size, but I don't know how you would find that other than to like call up the company and ask, what are your micron levels? What I did list though is basically a range that you're going to get. I watched this really fascinating video about Shetlands, and I didn't know about Shetlands. And this is all about like reading a micron count from the stats that you send off to like Texas A&M. And I was like listening, and it was like a half an hour long. And I was like, wow, if anyone walks in the room right now, they'd be like, what are you watching?
A real thrilling Friday night, right? Learning about microns. Yeah.
Well, Jen, I don't mean to interrupt, Emily. I just,
No,
Jen,
go for it.
your question points out such a quandary for so many people who want to make educated decisions about fiber, because it's, at least speaking anecdotally, it's the rare experience if I'm browsing online for yarn and I see a micron count, right? I mean, I can think offhand a few times I've seen it, and it's almost exclusively, Emily, to your point, you know, advertising the very low micron count, right? For folks who have sensitivities or who really are interested in the most buttery soft. And I think that for me, it's a frustration, because I feel like, as like coming from the knitter's perspective, like people are trying to, particularly buying yarn, not in person, which a lot of us have done during the pandemic, not feeling safe going into the yarn store and having to kind of spin the roulette wheel on buying yarn online. I think it speaks to the fact that a lot of us are going off of sort of just these things we hear about as like, okay, low micron count, good, I got to look for that, right? Okay, superwash merino, good, I got to look for that. There's almost these keywords or these concepts that we're introduced to through others or online, what have you, that sort of come to stand in as like something good, or like that we should want to gravitate toward as like, someone who wants to play around a fiber. And I hope, and I'm, heartened to see what I think is a bit of a shift toward people really trying to make more, not even just informed decisions about the fiber they use, but like just being thoughtful about like, where is this coming from and what's in it, right?
Yeah. I know that you go to a yarn store and you want to like test the fiber. I know Jen, you had mentioned like putting it against your skin, like your face. That's actually a really good one. Another good indicator is the inside of your arm, if it doesn't feel irritated there too. But I mean, I have bought something that felt completely soft, and then I went home and I made a sweater with it, and I still can't wear it just because it irritates my collarbone, even if I wear something underneath it.
Yeah. For folks who want to go deeper into like wearing wools with sensory stuff, I have a blog post around this, because it's a big topic. And when I did a poll on my stories a month or so ago about why people are not wearing their knits, like sensory stuff comes up for a lot of people. Wow. And it's so disappointing, like we're going to talk about black and white decisions later, but like a sweater that doesn't get worn is not a good ecological decision either, right? Like your money, your time, your energy, all that sheep's fur gone if you don't wear it. So and we're going there soon. First, Annalise, I want to ask you about choosing a yarn for knitting, right? So if you're standing there and you have a skein of yarn that's non-superwash and you want to use it and you're picking a pattern, like what are you looking for? How do your pattern choices vary when you're using a non-superwash yarn?
Yeah, so kind of touching on what I mentioned before about the qualities of superwash versus non-superwash. if I'm looking for, okay, so here's the example I'm thinking of, and I'm speaking from from having knit a garment that was not the most brilliant pairing of yarn to pattern in hindsight. Now that I know more about construction, for example, if I wanted to make like a cardigan, a men's cardigan with a shawl collar that's a garter stitch collar, I would not knit it in a superwash yarn because, like I mentioned, that thing is just going to droop right down, right? When you think about a garment that, traditionally men's garment maybe is modeled a bit more after, like I said, a woven fabric and a shawl collar, right? You wanted to have a bit of structure so that you could fold it up and have it around the neck or fold it down in a more casual way when it's buttoned. With a non-superwash wool, the natural, tendency for the yarn to grip on itself is going to give it a really nice structure, and it's going to give it that bit of like crispness and hardiness, both visually and in the literal, construction of the fabric that you're making. If you were to knit it in a superwash wool, or honestly, even a really, really soft non-superwash, like an alpaca blend, or something with like a plant fiber in it, it wouldn't look bad, but it might sag a bit because it's longer, like, right? Like we're going back to this question of weight and the volume of yarn you need to make a garment, and it would droop, right? Superwash is not going to tack on itself in the same way. And that results in gorgeous flow and drape, which for some garments is absolutely what you're looking for. But for others, it's just not, it's just the wrong pairing. So for me, now that I'm a more experienced knitter, and I'm really saying, even a year ago, I knit my partner a cardigan in this lovely alpaca linen wool blend that just essentially like melted, right? It was not a good pairing because the garment needed more structure. So when I think about matching a pattern to a fiber, I really think about, does this want to really sit and look boxy on the body, right? Am I looking for a really boxy cut? In which case I want a really kind of stiff, crisp yarn, right? Something that is perhaps from a coarser, a sheep that has a coarser wool, so that it does give a little bit more of that like effect of standing up on itself. Or do I want something, that's a non-superwash, that's maybe a merino or even blended with silk or llama or something that is really much more fluid and drapey for perhaps like a pretty blouse. So I think really you want to think about, or what I think about is, what is the visual effect I want on this? And do I want it to, when it really comes down to it, do I want it to kind of be crisp and hold its shape, or do I want it to have a little more drape, and do I want it to cling to the body a little more closely?
Yeah, what I'm hearing a lot is choose the fiber based on the properties you want, and that the properties are different. So you're wearing a very drapey sweater. Is it non-superwash?
It is, yes. So this is actually a single ply non-superwash wool. It's from Neighborhood Fiber Co. A fingering weight single ply that I paired with silk mohair. And I am one of those strange types who is super tolerant to really scratchy fiber. So I can wear mohair against my skin. I could wear like lopi against my skin. I'm one of those. But something, okay, and just to like plug again for coming from the non-superwash lovers perspective, I do sense that a lot of folks do have not fear, but a hesitation around using a non-superwash wool for a garment because they don't know how it's going to react. But I think one really wonderful kind of bridge point between like superwash land and non-superwash land is silk mohair. It is everywhere, and tons of people who would never touch non-superwash use silk mohair all the time. And I'm thinking, so you're already using a non-superwash fiber.
Yeah.
It's not a wool, but it can't be machine washed. And so folks are already have dabbled in a non-superwash fiber. So
they just haven't framed it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So I really want to encourage folks to like, there's no harm in trying.
Yeah. One of my suggestions for people who are wondering, should I do this for a whole sweater, is to get a skein and make a little swatch and pin it to the back of your shirt, or tuck it into your bra band if you wear bras, right? So that it's on your body and moving around, because I have been tricked so many times by the cheek rub, the arm rub, the walking around with it like tucked in my neck in the yarn store. But if you can replicate with a single skein, then you can find out if it's worth investing in. Yeah.
That's a really good point.
And just for another resource, Lauren, a designer from Bee in a bonnet, bee in the bonnet. Anyway, I'll be linking to her tomorrow. Is doing a whole series this month on yarn substitutions, and she's a very good writer. And the resources that she's putting out are, she has one out already, and they're just top notch. So if you're somebody who is interested in experimenting with different properties of yarn, because that's what determines a successful yarn substitution, definitely check out hers. Yes, Johanna says silk mohair is a gateway drug.
It's so true.
I love it.
So true.
Okay, so I want to get into ethical sourcing topics, and I want to establish some context here before we go in. First of all, like, everybody is at a different place with doing better. I think everybody is in this room because they're interested in either the technical aspects or in doing better. And everybody has different constraints, whether that's a knowledge gap or like not being ready to buy yarn that you haven't handled, or like availability. It's not in your neighborhood and you can't squish it, budget constraints, sensory issues, or even just overwhelm, right, when it comes to knowing. So everybody has different constraints. And I think that everybody has a different hierarchy of values, right? So some people are going to come into this like, okay, like social issues are my number one value, but I also care deeply about the environment, but I'm going to prioritize my decision making in a framework that goes in that order. Or it could be the other way around, or it could be something else. It could be, budgeting to take care of their family, right? So everybody is going to come into this kind of conversation with a different hierarchy of values, and there's no one right way, and there's no perfect product. And at the end of the day, we're also artists, right? And we need to be making a choice that gives us a medium that's the medium we want to be working in. So even if you had like the perfect product, if it was like the Cheerios of yarn, you might not be interested in knitting with it. For me, my opinion, and I have found it useful to think about these decisions over the last few weeks in terms of like, okay, like what is important to me? I feel like anybody who's knitting something by hand that they wear a lot and that they wear for multiple years, and they wear that instead of buying something fast fashion, has really made an improvement on what's out there. I had another friend online, Ellen, I'm not sure if she's here or not, but she told me that she's not stashing yarn anymore that's superwash. And I thought that was a really practical approach too, because sometimes it's the right thing for the project you want to make, but maybe you've just decided not to stash it. So I just want to say that I know that I and a lot of other knitters can do a lot of black and white thinking. And yeah, I want to make sure that I name that context in the room. The other thing I want to name here is I want to racialize this. I can make some semi-informed observations about the way that racial identity and racial equity show up in yarn sourcing, but like everything else with yarn sourcing, I'm not educated. And I want to know more. And I know that this is a topic that both of you have shared that you have some knowledge on. And I would love it if you could both tell me some of the things that specifically come up for you around racial equity when you're making sourcing decisions, and where we can learn more so that we can all kind of level up a little bit. Annalise, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, so, Jen, I so appreciate you pointing out that there are so many what can feel like competing concerns, right? It's like, okay, I want to shop locally, but okay, there's no Black or brown yarn producers that are in my area, but I also want to support Black and brown yarn producers. Okay, but I also, like there's so many ways in which the desires we have to harm less through our purchasing decisions can end up feeling imperfect, right? I guess for me, when I think about like the reasons that motivate me to want to make more what I see as ethical choices with the yarn that I buy, as well as my health and ecological concerns about preferring, natural fibers over synthetic ones or non-superwash over superwash, is that to me, the ecological impact of creating yarns that have to be heavily processed, like superwash yarns, for example, or even, mass produce yarns where the dyes they're using to produce the yarns get pumped into their wastewater and end up in the environment, end up into the drinking water system. We know that environmental harms disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, right? So like, even when we think about something as far removed as like wastewater treatment stemming from a, the dyeing of yarn, it is a racial justice issue because it, all environmental harm is impacting Black and brown people and Black and brown communities disproportionately more than it affects white communities. So when I think about, trying to minimize that harm with regard to how I spend my money on yarn, I try to really push myself to purchase more locally, to do research about who are the, dyers of color in my area. Do they offer non-superwash yarns, right? Some of them may not. And so for me, I'm probably not going to purchase their product, but maybe I can support them in a different way. So yeah, I guess like it does feel a bit abstracted to say like superwash yarn is a racial justice issue, but I do think there's a through line there, because when we're talking about the environmental impact of producing fiber, we have to talk about the fact that that environmental impact is not being distributed equitably across our communities.
Yeah, environmental impacts are racial justice issues. Sure. Yeah, thank you for sharing that perspective.
Yeah, that's really good. One thing I can add to that when it comes to like sourcing and thinking about like one community in particular that has gone through a lot is the indigenous community. And so I don't know if you've heard of Navajo churro sheep, but that's kind of making a comeback. And that's really interesting. So I was reading through Rebecca Burgess's book called Fiber Shed. She goes into the whole chain of custody and where things are dyed and how they're dyed and what that does on it, like how it impacts communities, especially like in India, where, there's a lot of runoff that will go into the water, and there's, children working in some factories, like, it gets in there and it talks about that kind of stuff. But she also talks a lot about the Navajo churro sheep. And the reason I bring it up is that they are like the oldest breed in America, and they were nearly wiped out, but through some conservationists, they were able to help bring it back, and it's gaining in popularity. And I would look out for that fiber and see what you think, because it has this huge micron count range, because it has like 3 different types of fleece. And so it can be almost down to like the silk fine fiber feeling. Wow. All the way up to like, in the 30s. So definitely play around with what you see. And as far as like sheep breeds, because I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have some Navajo churro to spin from a conservationist in Canada. I'm very excited to get into it. Her name's Leanna, and she does super cool things. Again, I'll try and get a link to her for you. Okay, so yeah, I kind of just want to talk a little bit more about things that go into choices. So let me tell you, like, okay, so I used to live in Maryland, and I worked on the board of a sustainable ag group. And there was an immense amount of frustration from people who weren't certified organic, because it's not financially sustainable enough for them to pursue it. And so they're naturally farming, which doesn't have a label. And so, there are all these people in the community who are like, I'm not going to buy from you, I buy organic, who are buying like organic produce from across the ocean with a carbon footprint through the roof, right? Or who are like, there's a lot of nuance we lose when we want to have quick, easy conversations. And, I hear a lot of people like, I don't use superwash because it's bad for the environment. Okay. But what I don't know is are there water processing differences, right? Like I hear from dyers that there are like, okay, like natural dye is really great. And there are other dyes that are also not as bad as the ones that we hear, like really like, there's a lot of middle ground. There's a lot of nuance in all of this. So I feel like, what am I missing when it comes to non-superwash yarns? Like, are there water use issues? Are there carbon issues? Like, yeah. Do you want to start, Emily?
Yeah, I can dive in here. I'll just say, first of all, that wool is 100% carbon. So yay for everyone who buys wool.
What does that mean?
So carbon is what is that's what you want in the ground, right? We want to take the carbon out of the air and get it back into the ground, or carbon sequestration, right?
We're
So
locked up.
yeah. There are a lot of ranches out there that are doing amazing things with regenerative farming that are pulling carbon back into the ground, and they're using less water, and they're doing rotational grazing practices, and all things that are helping the planet in that way. But just by the very fact of you buying yarn is really great. It's a good choice. And what I find interesting is that because it's 100% carbon, you can literally like cut up an old sweater and toss it in the compost and it'll turn back into soil eventually. So that's really cool. And I feel like I could go so many places with your question, right? Because you talked about the farmers and the certified organic, and I grew up in a farming community too, and actually like worked for a large farming corporation where I was like a bug scout, and I would go into the fields and I would take counts, and I would come back with my report, and I would talk to the agronomist, and we'd be like, okay, do you recommend that this field be sprayed? Well, the bugs are close to their end of their life cycle, so no, because it wouldn't do any good. So you want the larva stage. I mean, it's really interesting, when you get into like, what do you put on the field to prevent a field from being destroyed? I had called a really good friend of mine who has a family farm, and they grow berries. And I was like, okay, so give it to me straight. What does certified organic actually mean? Because I didn't know. And she said that in agriculture, it means that you are using products that the organic industry has deemed allowable, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with toxicity. So I thought that was really interesting because, as I was asking her this question, she's like, yeah. Like she wanted to dive in and tell me all about it, right? Because she is like the same kind of farmer that you were talking about. So like the organic industry allows one type of spray to be used on food. And the interesting thing about that is like, if you use the same spray on a field over and over again, then eventually you're going to get these little super bugs that are resistant to anything, and they're virtually impossible to kill. So there's drawbacks to that. The organic conversation leads to a lot of questions, but basically I would say the moral is that if you're buying something that says organic, but it doesn't have any sort of certification on the label, and it doesn't go into what is actually organic, then I'd be a little leery. So I don't know if I answered the question.
I didn't ask a question. I just threw it at you. Yeah, I kind of wanted to see what would come up. Yeah, I think that, I think that if I were going to ask a question, it would be something like, I want to do better, but I have a full-time job.
Yeah.
I almost have 2 full-time jobs. I almost have 3 full, right? You keep going. Like, I don't have time to become an expert. So when I was farming, I would just like, and people are like, well, what are we supposed to do? I would say, you just go to your local farm and meet your farmer. You see how they treat their animals and see if you want to eat that. But that's out of reach for so many of us. So, if we don't want to fall into the trap of it must be good because it's organic, and I'm not slamming on organic. I'm just saying that is not always critical information when we're trying to make an informed decision. And we don't necessarily, like, I'm sure that there are non-superwash yarns that also have implications that none of us know about, right? So what would you do if you wanted to make a yarn sourcing decision and you couldn't buy your yarn?
Well, I'm sorry, Annalise, if you want to jump in here. I was just going to say one thing that I forgot to mention is with natural dyeing, one really big drawback is that it requires a lot of water. And so I try to cycle as much as I can or soak the material. There's a lot of rinsing. So yeah, that's a really big drawback when it comes to natural dyeing. And whereas acid dyes, they don't require as much rinsing at all because the makeup of the acid dye allows it to adhere so well to the fiber that there's just not much runoff.
The trade-off is often metals, right?
Yeah.
So there are trade-offs. And I know that I had, is it Brittany from Crux Fibers messaged me, and she was like, look for vegetable material because the processing even of non-superwash yarn can be really intense. Annalise, what do you know here?
Oh man, I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, okay, it's like to me, this really brings up such a fundamental challenge, which is every single one of the decisions we're making here is a trade-off in some way, right? Okay, I have this like pile of yarn in front of me, but I just want to like, and this is not a commentary on any of these producers. This is just like, for example, okay, I have this lovely non-superwash. This is Malabrigo worsted. It's non-superwash. It's soft as butter. It's fabulous. This was grown in Peru. And this made it to, okay, this was gifted to me from someone's stash, but like this made it to the West Coast of the US, right? That burned tons of jet fuel and tons of carbon, right? I mean, like anything. And okay, and for another example, some of my absolutely precious, beloved, naturally dyed yarn from my friend over at Starbath Dyes, Nina, they're amazing. This came from Canada on the East Coast, right? And it's stunning. It's naturally dyed. I'm obsessed with it, and you should all buy their yarn, but it also, needed to be shipped to me. So to me, it's like, there's so many questions that we have to ask ourselves about the degree of harm that we're willing to, and I hate to be a downer, but that's really what it comes down to as far as I see it. It is about minimizing the harm we're doing both to other humans, the laborers who are making the products we buy, the animals who are sourcing serving as the source of the materials, and the planet itself, right? In the sense that they're, wastewater processing and the, amount of resources we're draining from the earth. So it's just, I really try to think, what are the most important things to me at this juncture, and how can I make a thoughtful, informed decision? I think that, Jen, you bring up such an important point, which is like, damn, you could spend so much time trying to find the answers here. And unfortunately, a lot of the supply chain with regard to, even non-superwash yarn is pretty obscured, which is really unfortunate. I think folks are trying to do more to shed light and kind of illustrate their supply chain and be transparent about their sourcing, let alone the products they use to dye their yarn. But I do think it's a frustrating position as a consumer and as someone who, for me, this tension comes up in that I love fashion and I love pretty garments and I want, this fiber that I purchased to make this was by no means local, right? But it's something I love and I'll wear 200 times, right? I mean, I'll wear it till it falls apart. So I think that's the real, I guess to me, I really want people, I think it's, while this is such an issue that speaks to how interconnected we are and how dependent we are on one another, it also is a very personal decision, right? People are free to buy and use whatever yarn they like. And I really appreciate, Jen, you make such a good point about sustainable clothing and sustainable fashion, period, which is the most sustainable things are the ones you're going to wear as many times as you can. And if that's an acrylic, mass produced big box store yarn made garment, great. That. And if you wear it a million times, that is wonderful. You're minimizing, that it isn't going to the landfill. But there are other choices you might make, in the raw material you use. But I think you bring up, at the top, you frame this really importantly, which is this is about just being thoughtful with the decisions we make about what we choose to where we choose to spend our money and what we choose to put on our bodies.
Yeah, the sweater our partner felt is not sustainable.
Oh,
I mean, you can
nightmare.
compost it, but it's not a great use of carbon, right?
Nightmare.
So I think that it would be really, I use this word inappropriately, but really nutritious to maybe think and brainstorm about, because this feels a little discouraging, right? This is a consuming based hobby we have. We use raw materials. Some of us love to acquire them and fill our houses with beautiful things. I'm going to refer to that as carbon sequestration from now on. Thank you.
I love it.
So I think that what I would do, right, and as a designer, I like to collaborate with other, with dyers, and I prefer to work with people who are not big in the industry, because I just find it so much more rewarding and meaningful. And I think the biggest names in the industry already have enough. Yeah, have enough. And I think it's really fun to find people who are doing things that are exciting and new. So, I think that my approach would be to reach out and ask people what they're excited about. as far as the social issues and the ecological issues and their decision framework. And so rather than being like, is this certified enough? Is this, low enough carbon? Opening up a conversation with people that's like, what's great about this? What are you excited about? Like, what makes your product sing in this lens for you that could be meaningful to me?
I love that.
Yeah.
And it speaks to that, like, we can learn from one another about these things. I've learned so much, even from being like, a year on knitting Instagram, learning from others who are super, super, well-versed in issues that I never thought twice about. Right. I mean, I just feel like that speaks to the fact that, having these conversations is how we can make more informed choices ourselves. Right. When we pull that knowledge.
Yeah. And like canceling your sweater because an undesirable person designed it, like also not sustainable, right? Like they're all like, sweaters should be worn, your yarn should be knit into something, or at least loved and appreciated in whatever form you like it in your cabinet. But buying products that feel really great, even if, and recognizing that they're not going to be perfect, and recognizing that there's no free pass and everything's a trade-off, and there are all different ways to do better. This has been really informative. Thank you. Yeah. Anything else, Emily, before we move out of ethics?
Close the door on ethics.
I think you two are definitely the stars of that topic. I'm just gonna sit here and talk about yarn and sheep.
Well, I'm glad we are all bringing different things to the conversation. Okay, so I want to talk about styling, right? So this is my this is non-superwash. It's from Ritual Dyes.
Oh, I love
Rambouillet. Yeah. I don't know how I can wear it against my neck. I shouldn't be able to, but I can, and I do all the time. Does somebody have to have like a prairie rustic cottagecore aesthetic to rock these yarns, right? Like I think that there's a narrative out there that non-superwash yarns are muted, that the colors are dull, that they're not as saturated. And I have some thoughts on this, but Annalise, I want to hear from you about your recommendations for people who want to experiment with adding these yarns to their wardrobes. Because I think that if we pick yarns that don't work in our wardrobes, we don't wear them.
Very good point. Yeah. Well, I'll take this opportunity to flex and show some of these amazing yarns to debunk this conception that non-superwash means muted. For example, this is some stunning non-superwash fingering from Shoba over at Serendipitous Wool. Just to highlight the fact that, in my view, non-superwash wool, I mean, it really speaks to the skill of the dyer. Like the dyers can make non-superwash bases just as vibrant, complex, deep, saturated as any, superwash merino. Superwash merino, is so common, and it sucks up dye really easily, right? Because of the way it's been treated. Non-superwash fibers don't react in the same way, but it doesn't mean that they can't take on that lovely depth of color. So for anyone thinking that, a non-superwash base means that you're going to only be in, pastel or super non-saturated land, that's just not true, frankly. And I think that also speaks to a bit of a phenomenon, particularly among indie dyers, that superwash is just so darn common that we're used to a certain look. And it's also kind of harder to find non-superwash bases among some of the even more popular indie dyers. So that's, it's not totally on the consumer. But with regard to styling, I guess the way I approach it is non-superwash can look just as chic and, deep and interesting as any superwash fiber. And I think there's this idea that, this is getting really granular, there's this idea that non-superwash is like texturally like thick and thin, that it's like necessarily super rustic in the sense that it's spun rustically. And frankly, that's just not the case. Again, I'll show off my lovely Starbath dyes from Nina, but I mean, it's so smooth. I mean, it's just a beautiful, plied merino. It's not bumpy and lumpy. There might be a little bit of vegetable matter in there that you find as you go along, but to me, that's part of the fun. So I really do think that folks are thinking about non-superwash as like something that is visually extremely rustic, in that it may have little neps or might be, more thick and thin, less uniform when it's spun. But again, I don't think that's the case. That may just be that mindset may be a phenomenon that non-superwash bases are just like not as common among like the really cool indie dyers.
Yeah.
So I think as far as styling goes, I really encourage people, and it's not a very satisfying answer, but with regard to constructing your own flows, I guess think of, with the properties of the yarn in mind, like we touched on earlier, think about what you want the finished product to look like. And then it's really just a case of like finding that non-superwash yarn. I think honestly, like the sourcing is more tricky than the actual like creation of a yarn into a garment. But Emily, I welcome your thoughts on that too, and Jen as well, because I really don't think it's not like a construction obstacle in my mind. It's really like the biases of the of the consumer, and perhaps having to be a little scrappier in finding dyers and producers who make the kind of yarn you like to look at and knit with on a non-superwash base. That's really the tricky part in my mind.
Yeah.
I feel like, Emily, I actually want to ask you a question about this that's not on the cheat sheet. So so hang on, because I want to give you a lot of runway on it. So I too, right? So I'm sure that Emily will show you her yarns, but like I also grabbed a handful of really like colorful yarns. Like I don't tend to gravitate towards neons anyway. And I think that some of that mythology might just be around, if somebody is drawn towards dyeing non-superwash yarns, are they also drawn towards more subtle colorways? I know that here in Portland, you can go and see like knitted wit at Close Knit. Like I have been to Close Knit before and seen like the same colorways for knitted wit, for example, in both superwash and in a non-superwash targhee. And it's really fascinating. Like it's not glossy, and now we know why, thank you. But it's also really, it's saturated, it's just different. And so I think that maybe that aesthetic is part of it. I swear I saw a non-superwash neon the other day. I'm not drawn towards neons, but it's a thing.
I have to show you. Unfortunately my light is really suboptimal, but I mean, this is naturally dyed and non-superwash from Pearl Scout. And it is the yellow is neon, I swear. Even if you can't tell.
I can't tell, but I believe you.
Yes, it is so bright. So yeah, Jen, that's such an interesting point. I had never considered that angle, but I think it's, there almost might be like a self-selecting phenomenon.
Yeah, that's right. And, and they're all different things, like indigo, right? Really beautiful colors. So yeah, Emily, I want to hear from you on color specifically, because I know you're a designer in your past life, and you have all of your yarns framed up behind you. And I think one of the things that you bring to the market that's special is like a really cohesive palette, right? Like I think there are only a couple dyers out there who do that. Like a lot of it's superwash, but like Wandering Flock has a very similar, like these things all go together. Like I think it's a huge service when dyers do that for us, because I'm terrible with color. But yeah, I want to hear from you too.
Yeah, thank you for that awesome setup. Both of you, like that was really good color information. And I do have some stuff that, so this is all non-superwash and, naturally dyed. And so you can see, you can get some really, really dark colors. This is dark purple that was done with logwood. And then this is coreopsis. And this, I don't know if you can totally tell, but this is almost like neon bright fall orange. It took like maybe half a summer's worth of flowers to get that color. And then this is done with indigo and then over dyed with fustic wood. So just depending on if you start at the beginning of an indigo vat where it's really dense, this was like ultra indigo, so it was super, super dark. And then put it in a really intense yellow, you can get a pretty vivid green. So natural dyeing really, like if you can find the materials, you can get some really amazing colors. I will show you this. This is really fun. This is like my Bible, the art and science of natural dyes. If you're a natural dyer or really interested in that, I just wanted to show you like a little comparison. I don't know if you can see this little graphic right here. So this one, so these were all dyed in cochineal, which is the bug that lives on the prickly pear cactus. And these were done in weld, which is like this ancient yellow dye. Actually, I grow this in my backyard. So the first one is, they're all mordanted in alum. This is wool. This one's alpaca, and this is superwash yarn. So you can totally tell the difference in how those fibers can suck up the color, and the same thing over here. This is the superwash and this is the not superwash wool over here. And the reason that is because, you know, oh, and I've got a picture of yarn. Here you go. There's
There you
some
go.
holes and like the inner part of the core. But you know, when the scales are minimized, then there's no barrier. So the acid dyes especially can right in there like super fast. Same thing with I've used like a superwash yarn and just like wrapped it around to like hold the yarn together when I was first starting, and I would put it in the natural dye bath and it would come out and I would have my color, but then like that little piece of yarn that was holding it together would be like 20 shades darker. And I was like, what is going on? But you know, I was brand new and I didn't understand that concept yet. I hadn't even read it yet. So but it is possible to get some really intense dark colors. It just depends on the ratio of the material and how much you mordant it. And so time, temperature, and intensity are kind of like the three pillars of natural dyeing anyway. So there's a lot of possibilities out there.
I've heard that the lower the plies and the less dense the yarn is, the more vibrant the colors will be too, because it's less to get through.
Oh,
True, false?
I honestly
Like I've
don't.
heard people say, I don't love knitting with single ply, but I love dyeing it because that might have been Larissa.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, because it takes the color so much better, takes the color so differently. But I feel like I have some of your yarn in different weights and they look the same. So I don't know.
I don't know the answer.
Okay, we don't have to know all the answers. Okay, cool. I want to pivot a little bit and dig into breed specific yarns. And we've already covered a lot of this, so we don't have to beat it up too much, but I feel like breed specific yarns are having a big moment right now. You know, I know people who are like, oh, I'm over merino, it feels too bad, I never would use it again. I have been having, like I said, great success with Rambouillet, and I know that you, Emily, have chosen a merino Rambouillet blend. How did you come to choose that particular fiber? And how is it different from the 100% standard merino, superwash or not, that thinners might be used to seeing?
Excellent question. Yeah, so when I was sourcing my fiber, I came across Jeannie Carver of Shaniko Wool Company. And when I started talking to her and about basically all like the regenerative farming practices and the responsible wool standard certification and all that stuff, I was instantly hooked. And then I was asking about the sheep, and I didn't know what a Rambouillet was. But basically the merino Rambouillet cross sheep that I use, it's specific to the US because it's bred because it's good for semi-arid range conditions. So you'll see a lot of merino Rambouillet blend sheep in the Western United States because that's where they are meant to be, or where their environment is, and they thrive there. They're also known more for their wool than like their meat production, for instance. So anyway, I use merino Rambouillet, and Rambouillet is actually also merino. Every merino comes from Spain, so Spanish merino, but the Rambouillet is just like the French version of that. So has some different characteristics. When you put them together, they are just the ideal animal for that part of the world. Yeah. And also, you know, how I was talking about micron count earlier and wool grades, I wanted to add a little bit in there that would help anybody looking at labels, because of all of these breed specific yarns you're starting to see. You might wonder, well, like, what is a Targhee and what is a Columbia? So there's fine, medium, and like coarse, or super fine, medium, and coarse. And so in the super fine category, you're going to get Delaine merino. Fine, you're going to get merino and Rambouillet. So basically it's kind of a small category. But then you've got mediums, which ranges between like 23 and 29 microns, which are still perfectly soft and you can use close to the skin for most people. And so some of the breeds that you want to look out for there are like Targhee, Columbia, Finn Sheep, Corriedale, Dorset, Shetland, Oxford, Shropshire. And then when you get into the coarse sheep, there's Border Leicester, Lincoln, and Romney. And so those are, I mean, like I have this book, The Field Guide to Fleece, and there's like 100 sheep breeds in this book, but there's also a version of this book that has 200 sheep breeds. So, I mean, I just gave you a tiny, tiny little like sample size of what you could look out for there. But I just pick things that I thought I come across, and so you might hear more often. So if you see something on a label in that medium range of sheep, the coarseness, range, then you might be like, hey, I could probably do this. I mean, Targhee is very soft, and Columbia and Shetland can be too. So I hope that opens up your repertoire for what you can find when you're looking in the yarn store. And I feel like I was really umming quite bad in that answer.
I'm away. It's fine. We're all just people here. Yeah, I feel like when I was new, people would try and talk to me about specific breeds, or I would buy like a spinning book and I would be like, blah, blah, I can't retain any of this. It just sounds like white noise. It's the same thing with taking pictures. You start talking to me about f-stops and I'm like, I really want to know this, but I can't keep it in my brain.
I know.
But I feel like picking one and experimenting with it is a really great way to expand, like you said, expand our repertoire. And I think for me, it's really helpful to know that the reason that I can wear this Rambouillet is because it's such a similar micron count, right? Like that's a secret decoder ring tidbit there. And if knitters have worked with like some of Brooklyn Tweed's yarns, right? Like those are breed specific yarns too. And so if you know that you can wear one of those, you can look for a similar fiber in a store and be relatively confident that it'll be in that same micron count. So if you know that you can wear, unlike Arbor, which is Targhee, like then you know that if you find a independent dyer who's using Targhee, that you could grow in that direction with some confidence. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah.
To pare it down some. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Annalise? Anything you gravitate towards?
I'm really, really, really into Blueface Leicester lately. Like,
is that silky?
To me, yes, but again, I'm like, I can like let low be against my skin, so I'm like not the person to ask. Okay. So I think I first became fixated on Blueface Leicester at Rhinebeck a few years ago. The only time I've been in 2019. I got to pet there's those aisles of beautiful animals being shown off in their glory. And I was just stunned at how honestly soft these sheep, which, you think from my perspective, not growing up anywhere near agriculture or farming, think of sheep and wool as crusty and prickly, right? But these sheep were these gorgeous long curly locks of their hair, which just blew my mind. So that's the first time I sort of I think thought more about the different properties of different breeds of sheep and how that might affect the yarn as a finished product. And then subsequently in the past 2 years, I keep, I think I must have bought someone's Blueface Leicester yarn at one point, been wait, I love this. It's got a lovely structure, but it's also got this shine to it that I find so compelling. So whenever I see Blueface Leicester, I'm like, oh, I like that. So I gravitate toward it. I love an untreated merino as much as the next gal. I do think I gravitate toward, as far as breed specific wools, I gravitate toward perhaps a coarser or a hardier wool, because I like that crunch. And I do find, just totally anecdotally, that the garments I make with what I think of sturdier breeds feel like they don't pill as much and they don't feel quite as precious and delicate. Sometimes you want that precious, delicate feel, So I think for me, the one breed that jumps to mind is Blueface Leicester. I do think that, I'm heartened to see more people being even aware of the concept of a breed specific yarn. I'd be really curious to hear both of your perspectives because you're both knitters as well. But for me, I came to knitting by buying, like Lion brand acrylic, right, at Joanne or whatever, or Michael's, in middle school. And I didn't come to be I'm a yarn snob, I'll say it. I didn't come to be such a yarn snob until very, late and very recently in adulthood. So to me, it's like heartening to see people even glomming onto by people, I mean, let's say like the consumer end of things, the knitter end of things, seeing knitters and crocheters latch onto the idea of breed specific yarns to me is heartening because it shows that folks are putting thought into what they're buying. Even becoming aware of the concept of like, oh yeah, a yarn made from one specific type of sheep is going to have really different qualities unique to that breed that are different from a yarn that is just a mix of a bunch of different breeds, right? That's, that is one that you get from like a more mass produced or a larger scale yarn maker. So yeah, I think it's cool.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if it's just because of the like huge uptake in knitting culture, right? Like people who knit like 15 sweaters per year, like might like to work with a different medium every now and then.
Mm-hmm.
It's different.
Absolutely. I love woolly, sheepy, crunchy yarns too. Like there were a couple years where that's all I would buy. And then I would just make cardigans and cabled cardigans. I just love a different tactileness to deal with. It's yeah, you got to switch it up. Otherwise it gets boring.
And it's good in your wardrobe too. Like you're filling different wardrobe holes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I want to go right back to wearability because we're right next to wearability. So the other thing I hear from knitters is that they're hot. Knitters are all hot. They're all knitting sweaters that are too hot for them to wear. I love that you offer both fingering and sport weight yarn, and sport is another thing that I'm seeing a lot more of in the market, at least in the US.
Yeah.
Is there a benefit to non-superwash for temperature regulation? Like my intuition is like less plastic, it must be cooler, but is that baloney?
All I can tell you, just because I haven't like scientifically measured this, is just that wool is it's heat regulating, right? Because that's what it's supposed to do on the body too. So it's heat regulating, but also it holds the heat in, but it also allows the heat to escape because it has this amazing ability to take heat and moisture and move it out of the hair shaft into the colder temperatures and keep the skin a little bit drier. I mean, honestly, if you look at like every clothing company right now, everyone's using wool in some form or another, like socks, underwear are made out of wool too. But I totally, get what you're saying, because if you have a really thick thermal sweater on and it's warm inside, you're going to sweat. So it's probably wicking the sweat away from you. It hasn't dried yet. So I don't know if there's a difference between superwash and non-superwash as far as temperature is concerned.
Cool.
I'm going to pipe in here and say there absolutely is.
Okay.
Understanding.
Okay.
Anecdotally, like my superwash, this is specifically like goes to the qualities of wool, but like totally echo everything Emily said. Wool, untreated wool, is naturally bacteria resistant, right? Like, it will not stink as fast as most other fibers, most other garments made of any other fiber. It's also like, it's not, people use the word self-cleaning to describe wool, and I'm like, that's a little bit of a misnomer, but like, it's very resistant to stains. It's resistant to, smell and bacteria. And often like the best way to clean your wool garments for me is like pop them on a hanger and hang them up in a strong breeze and let the air kind of clear them out a little bit. Obviously you can wash your wool items, right? Like give your sweaters a nice bath. I honestly, once a year is probably enough, depending on how often you're wearing them. But anecdotally, the one superwash sweater I have and wear a lot because I really like the way it looks, it stinks up way, not to be gross, but it smells way faster than any of the non-superwash sweaters that I also wear with the same frequency, if not more often. So anecdotally, I'm convinced that the, it's not denaturing, but like, coating and, inhibiting those properties of wool that are so nice by, superwashing wool, it absolutely affects the finished product in the, it traps, I'm convinced it traps the bacteria And it doesn't allow those wonderful natural properties of wool to really shine. But again, it has its place. Like, I don't want to, superwash has its place. Most people aren't going to hand wash a baby garment. Let's be real. A new parent with a little baby who's say popping in the sweater probably doesn't have the bandwidth to hand wash or even hang up outside the little baby's wool sweater. I totally get why a superwash sweater makes more sense in that context, but non-superwash wool is superior on that count.
So I feel like, I have a kid and almost all her stuff is non-superwash. I don't gift non-superwash baby items very often, but sometimes I do, because like really when they're that small, it's just a little swish. And my anecdote is I feel like superwash and cotton stain so much faster, and because they're glossy, you can see those stains a lot easier. People are like, cotton for baby knits, and I'm like, I wouldn't. You look at that funny with applesauce in your hand and you have a stain. So go with the wool, a nice low micron wool, right?
Yeah. Well, Jen, I want to let you get to your next thing. I just want to.
That is the next thing.
Oh, yeah.
That's the next question.
I wish I'd saved this. It was months ago I saw this post, but I saw a really thoughtful post by, I believe, a knitwear designer talking about this exact issue, gifting baby garments that are non-superwash versus superwash. She had this fascinating photo array that basically showed a superwash sweater that her child, wore for years with just horrible, really, really deep set in stains and that had almost discolored the fabric after washing, right? You could literally see the fabric had shifted in color with these specific stains that in theory should be washable because the fiber is washable, right? That's the whole point. And this person was suggesting that to hell with the, superwash baby garments. They were basically advocating it's totally fine to have a non-superwash baby sweater. It's going to resist stains better in the first place. So you're not really going to face this problem of the staining issue, and it's going to last longer. So I thought that was really thoughtful. And yeah.
Superwash just wears out faster and loses its shape faster. So if you're knitting with the intention of making an heirloom garment,
such a good point.
Yeah.
Now that's a super good point, because it will wear off over time, because those polymers, those little microplastics are going to slough off and into your water.
Such a good point. Oof.
The
choice,
and they just lose their shape easier, because they don't have that grip. Again, though, a baby garment that gets felted when somebody washes it is also not the dream. So it really depends on the audience. Cabling is also another really great tip for hiding and disguising stains, because the texture loses those stains much faster. But this is a great lead into our next topic. I have one more after this, so we're right on time. Any other thoughts on preciousness? I know a lot of people are wary of wearing their knits because they don't want to ruin them. Yeah. This is for anyone who feels like they have an answer.
I have an answer. So a lot of the way that I handle the non-superwash wool is through my research and just feeling understanding the preciousness of the fiber. I didn't realize that soap has a lot to do with soap and water have a lot to do with the weakness of wool. So wool is its weakest when it's wet, but it's mechanically strongest at a certain pH level. So I just wanted to go into wool wash a little bit.
Neat.
Yes. So you want your wool wash to be just slightly acidic, because that way the fiber is going to be its strongest. And when I was researching this, I was looking into laundry detergent, and I didn't realize that laundry detergent is super alkali. It's between 8 and 12. So the higher you go up in the scale, the more alkali, the smaller you get more into the acidic realm. And so it's actually not best to use any sort of laundry detergent on your knits, especially woolite. And I don't know why they call it woolite, probably because it's, it denotes, that it's very delicate. But if you do have to use something to wash your wools in, then I would probably do a few drops of dishwashing soap, because that's more on the neutral scale. It's at a 7, which is about the same as water. And
If
actually,
you don't have a wool wash.
if you don't have a wool wash, I would use that to substitute. Like Dawn and Palm Olive have a pH around 7. So it's not a 5, but it's better than.
Would you toss in vinegar or something to just bring it down?
So I wouldn't just like toss the whole thing in vinegar. I know that vinegar helps neutralize, like if you get salad dressing on a stain or something like that. But I would just test it because a lot of, in my case, natural dyes can be pH sensitive. And so I would hate to like ruin the color on something just by throwing the whole thing. But that's a really good
Pitch
lead.
it right in vinegar, whatever.
Just
That's a
just
good
burning
point.
up in
That's
some
a really
acid.
good point. Yeah. Yeah.
So
that's
when you
really
go to the
interesting.
yarn store and like, I know it's hard because you've already spent like all this money on yarn and then you've spent money on the pattern and then you see that little bottle of wool wash on the counter. You're like, nope, I'm not spending any more money. I'm like, you should just get it that once and then you'll have it kind of forever. I think it's worth it because it
Lasts forever.
Yeah, I would buy it.
Also, the smells that some of these wool washes have are like dreamy. And at least for me, because I don't wash my wool garments almost ever, the smell, I use like a Yucaland jasmine. So all of my wool garments have this like wonderful, very delicate jasmine tint to them. And it's like, it brightens my day.
That sounds lovely. I have fig from Soak and I love it.
Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Also,
yeah.
and I block a lot of stuff and I use wool wash when I block. I don't know why. It's just part of the spell that I cast, I guess, when I'm blocking things.
Oh, me too. Me too.
So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Last topic. Okay. So you may know I have a pattern coming out at the end of this month that uses non-superwash yarn. I worked with Hudson and Woolco on that, and I believe that their yarn comes from O-Wash, or O-Wool. It's not superwash. It is, after I like did my swatch, they were like, that looks great. We want you to go up a needle. And I was like knitting it on an 8 and it's worsted. And I was like, there's no way, it's too loose. It's not going to work. They're like, we just want you to do one swatch and then you can decide. Like, we won't tell you, but just swatch. Will you swatch? I was like, I'll do it. But like, so I'm swatching and I'm like, this is like, I feel like I'm making a fisherman's net. This is not going to work. And I blocked it and it filled in beautifully.
Wow.
It bloomed, it's soft, it has drape, it's not loose at all. It's the perfect density. And I wasn't expecting that, right? So what else do I not know about working with non-superwash yarns as I'm knitting them?
I can jump in and start. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, it's not like, what don't you know? There's not a good generalized answer in that, like, it is so dependent on the fiber, right? I'm thinking about like some piece fleece piece fleece worsted that I swatched, which I'll reveal myself as a lazy swatcher because I rarely wash and block my swatch. But this time I did because I was like, okay, this yarn's very precious. And piece fleece does say our yarns bloom beautifully when washed and blocked. So like, please do that. So I was like, okay. And I did notice that it's a, I believe I want to say I forget what the wool is, but it's a domestic wool and then it's 25% mohair. So it's got a really interesting it's the dreamiest yarn ever. Highly recommend. And it did that, you know, that it did bloom significantly, not such that I was like, I have to adjust my needle size dramatically. But I wanted to see how it, you know, changed a little bit post blocking. But then again, there's some, you know, wools that are not going to change dramatically in size when block, you know, it's not going to mess up your gauge, I should say, after blocking. But I think the wonderful, cool thing about non-superwash wool in particular is that it does like puff up beautifully when blocked. And that is because it's not, the wool fibers are not being either, as Emily mentioned, either, you know, it's descaled or, you know, trapped with a polymer. It's funny because one of the things I love most about knitting with non-superwash fibers with regard to how they react is that when you're blocking, and I see so many people talk about how they don't block or they hate blocking, and I'm like, blocking is the most fun part of knitting. I love blocking. Blocking is my favorite part. I can't wait to block every time because particularly with non-superwash wool, it's just an opportunity to like kind of set the garment, and let's talk about garment knitting specifically. You can kind of like set it how you want it, and it's going to look very similarly to how you like pin it into place when it fully dries, which is something I love because you can really like get experimental and play around. And honestly, you can kind of like fudge some of your sizing. You know, if you've knit something and if you didn't get the sleeves quite as long as you wanted them to, you can really kind of tug around with, you know, being mindful of the delicacy of wool when it's wet, as Emily mentioned, to really like put it into a place that you want it. And it will really, you know, it can really change your finished product. I want to note that when non-superwash wool is when superwash wool is wet, it like grows dramatically. But my anecdotal experience has been that it has this tendency to almost shrink back into place. It will like, you know, my sense is it grows a lot when wetted, but it has this, like I've, you know, pinned superwash, and then as it's blocked, it's almost like shrinks back into place. Yes. So I end up with these kind of weird, like horrible, like divots along the garment. And to me, that's like, oh, I don't like that. The thing I love about blocking a non-superwash wool is that it's like, it's pretty much, you know, unless you're blocking incredibly aggressively, in which case, like, God help you, you know where it's going to stay where you want it to be when you're pinning it. And then when it dries, it, you know, it generally, if you block properly, like it will conform to the shape you pinned it into, because of that, you know, almost stretch that you can get when you wet a wool. So yeah, I kind of went on a tangent there with your question, Jen, but yeah, I don't know. I just think non-superwash, you know what you're getting, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
like,
you definitely have a better sense.
Yeah.
So designer's perspective, I prefer piece knitting to knitting in the round because I love blocking so much. There's nothing less satisfying than blocking it in the round sweater. Like, dang, like it just is so unsatisfying. And you're right, like especially with a non-superwash yarn, but even with superwash, like it does learn, right? And I learned that in my tailor years. Like wool is like clay, you really can shape it, and it'll lose some of that with each washing, but it will not lose all of it. And the more like close to the sheep your yarn is, and the more crimp is in it, like the more it's going to learn. And steam is a really great way to just be like, you're like this now.
Yes.
My first time designing with superwash yarn, I blocked my swatch, knit my sweater. It's like 42 feet long.
Oh.
And I was like, it was Malabrigo Rios, which is a stretchy yarn anyway. And I just was like, I was a mess. Anyway, for people who do want to use superwash yarns, you know, I always suggest that when you block while your yarn is soaking, pin out the border of the dimensions that you're going for. And then after you do your, you know, step on your yarn burrito, you just drop it in and then pin it out to those measurements. And wide. Yeah, like when I'm doing superwash, like it's like, I like to
Yep.
Because you have to, it will be positively rippled. You will be in a panic. You will be sure your sweater is going to fit you and the rest of your family all at the same time. And sure enough, when you come back in the morning, as long as you have padded out so that when it shrinks up, you don't have those, like it's not overlapped, then you will have a result that you can wear happily. But it's not as satisfying. But I do find that the other wools do have some of that. They do stretch when they're wet. They do require delicate handling. And even then, like I have needed to pat some non-superwash, some of the silkier. That probably has to do with if they're fine, right? Or
I think it's
yeah.
I think it totally speaks to the fiber composition.
Yeah. I think that's it, guys. So does anybody, I'm in awe of those of you who have been with us the full 90 minutes.
Kidding. Kudos.
I'm just imagining all of you are knitting. Yeah, is there anything that anybody wants to come off mute and ask a question on, or pop something in the chat? Thank you, Leslie.
Oh.
I'm glad. I'll just hang out for a second, just in case somebody wants to get brave and say hi. You know, I see that we have a number of dyers in the room, and I hope that has been fun. It's so cool to see familiar faces, and I'm hoping that I'll get to connect with some of you that aren't in my audience tomorrow on Instagram. We have not yet decided where we're going to post this replay. But at the very least, it will go out to our individual audiences. So we don't know yet if we're gonna like put it on YouTube and be like, hello world. But at the very least, like I will be emailing it out to my mailing list. And Emily and Annalise will also get a copy. Yeah, Vicky, we're gonna do a replay. I am recording it. I did some research. My computer says it has enough memory. We've got this. I will at least get a file. And I will find out. We're gonna learn how to take a recorded Zoom and give it to you.
Airmail.
Yeah.
Well, I no one has to answer if there's like no obligation, but I'm just really curious. Like if I know for me, I think I shared a little bit at the top of like what brought me to my non-superwash evangelism was really like learning more about natural fibers, like clothing wise, and just kind of understanding the impact of synthetic fibers on human health, animal health, and the environment, which like led me down a rabbit hole until being like, oh wait, what is this weird thing they do to wool? But I'd love to know, like, are there folks who like, have never knitted with non-superwash or only knit with non-superwash? Like, I'd love to know like what brought you to, because I find when I pose questions about this on Instagram, where I like to rant about this stuff, I always get, I feel like I learn so much from people's responses, because some folks will say like, oh yeah, like, honestly, so many people respond like way more thoughtfully and with more nuance than I view it, because I'm like, I feel one way. And I always learn so much from people saying like, here's how I come to this discussion. And, I use superwash for X purpose. I don't use superwash for this. Here's what I like about it. And here's what I don't. Here's the barriers that prevent me from like jumping, both feet into only knitting with non-superwash. So I'd love to know if folks care to share like what, where do you fall on either side, or, on this assemblage of different options. I can look in the chat.
Leslie says, starting my journey knitting with non-superwash. Yeah,
Awesome.
I think a lot of people start there. It's widely available. It tends to be really affordable. It's just generally, I think, less intimidating.
Yeah, it is like so interesting to me how I feel like Jen, you and I talked about this in the DMs, like how it seems like so many indie dyers are like, it's only superwash merino or even like 75-25, right? Merino nylon. And I just like, I want to know the provenance, like when did that become the norm? I'm just so curious. And I know someone also messaged, I'll have to go back and search in my messages. Someone had a really thoughtful comment about how they started, 15 years ago when they started knitting, there was only one type of fiber available. And now there's so many. So I'd love, that is something that continues to intrigue me.
Emily knows the answer.
Yeah. So when I was trying to source wool at the very beginning of this journey, I was looking, the wholesaler route, and I wanted non-superwash yarns. And so that's what I was looking for. And I found that I had a really hard time piecing together like a family of yarns. I could find one weight and maybe two, but then they would discontinue one. And I'd be like, well, I can't, have like a worsted weight non-superwash yarn and that's it. So that's when I had to get a little bit more creative and start, like, I went to like the Oregon Sheep Owner or Association and website. And I just started cold calling people because I figured, well, I'll just go somewhere local, and I tried to find something that way. But the wholesale route, I would say, is very stacked with superwash yarns, and it's hard to piece together an entire family of something. And it's just because, well, when I emailed this certain company and I was like, you just discounted sport weight yarn. And they're like, well, it's just not, people aren't buying it. So I think it's got to be like a cultural shift or like a mindset shift where everyone just decides that maybe we need to start doing more non-superwash. And if there's more of a demand for it, then I think more indie dyers are going to be buying it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like you mean like consumer driven or?
Well, for a long time, like I'm not terribly knowledgeable about this, but Hannah Thiessen is, and she talks about, for a long time, like we wouldn't have a wool industry if it weren't for like the military investing heavily in superwash merino, right? Like, so that's why we have it. That's how we got here. You know, and it's only, I think, with the rise of knitting that started, you know, the big increase in knitting that started with like the stitch and bitch revolution in the mid noughts that, you know, we've had enough knitters to really drive consumer demand to give us something different. It's not something I'm terribly knowledgeable about the history with the military and the superwash.
It's interesting that you do say that. And I would say that like mills are kind of having a comeback now too, because I mean, I'm not like an expert on this in history, but when NAFTA happened, that was huge because then we were able to trade with a lot, get a much cheaper product in other parts of the world. And so the mill industry just like dried up overnight. And a lot of people had all of this wool and then no one to process it. So people were stuck either going out of business or trying to find a different place to get their product processed. And I think that more and more people are starting to open mills up again, and which is amazing, but it's like old machinery. So if you want to run a mill, you need to buy this machinery and then you need to learn how to fix it or like find a new part, or I don't know. It sounds daunting. The people that run a mill now that are using like years old equipment, but it is making a comeback. And I love hearing about people that are investing in that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you just told us a story about how buying yarn that's been shipped back and forth across the world twice is supporting your local rancher. You know, I mean, if a mill is not something that's available to you and the only way that you can have your small ranch and stay afloat is to use, you know, commercial mills on the other side of the world, like that's a value.
Yeah.
That's why I really want folks to like, not to be prescriptive about it. I'll turn it back on myself. I've been challenging myself and trying to be more thoughtful about like the yarn that I'm buying. Obviously as a, you know, private yarn collector, curator, as Jen suggested, a carbon sequesterer in my own home. You know, I love beautiful yarn as much as the next person, but I've really been trying to support and focus on like producers who are like farming the sheep in the land within 200 miles of me, milling it within 200 miles of me, dyeing it with plants they grew on their own land, right? Like that is often hard to find. I'm spoiled in that I live in a place where I do have a couple options for that. Shout out to Local Color Farm and Fiber in Puyallup, Washington. But yeah, so I mean, it just speaks to how even attempting to like make an informed decision and support, you know, like domestic ranching comes with its own ethical consequences in that there's, you know, in order to get that yarn to a consumer, it has to be sent around the world, right? Or not the world, but like sent around the country and they bounce from the rancher to the mill to the consumer. So I think that's, I don't know, to me, it's like, oh, I just wish we could get our hands on beautiful things and support these people we really want to support, and that didn't, you know, require burning so much fuel to get it to us. But it's a goal I hope I try to strive for in my own yarn acquiring, while also, you know, not limiting myself. And I don't know, that's a whole separate issue. Compulsive yarn buys.
And it's
a separate issue.
There are two dyers in the house who have shared really interesting perspectives. So Vicky Ship Yarn, thank you, says that starting out as an indie dyer, non-superwash is actually super intimidating because of the fear of felting during the dye process.
Yeah.
And then Kelsey Garner, who made the lovely yellow yarn in my local meadow pattern, and her Instagram handle is knitting nikabi, and I'm probably saying that wrong, and I need to look up how to pronounce that correctly. So please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, Kelsey. She says, I know I had to make the choice between non-superwash or superwash. There was an almost moral dilemma. Since superwash, due to its convenience wash factors, means more business. And because of its popularity, there was an almost fear factor of not being self-sustaining by sticking to just superwash. And I think this might be a struggle that new dyers have. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, like on the design side, feel pressure to make in the round sweaters, and I don't think they're better. I also don't prefer, like I said, I really love blocking flat pieces and I really hate small circumference knitting, but yeah, like whenever you take a route that is less traveled or that people are intimidated of for any reason. It's terrifying. Yeah, especially if you count on your income. Thank you both for sharing this perspective. I think that's really useful.
Jen, I would love to, like, this is just a thought. There's so many awesome dyers, indie dyers who do have non-superwash yarn that I'm always trying to gas up and evangelize about. Speaking of, back to your point of the positive elements of, like, you know, how we can encourage each other to, you know, think about the wonderful things that we love about this craft, and how to, you know, encourage each other to like honor that part of our art and our craft. I would love to, you know, we can collaborate or just shout out at some point some of, like, our favorite dyers who are offering non-superwash yarn, because I'm always trying to, like, gather that information, and I dream of one day making a database. So,
and you have a local non-superwash dyers list for, like, by region within the region, right?
Yeah, I've been, like, slowly trying to compile various little, like, short guides of, like, non-superwash dyer or non-superwash producers, like, by region, starting with my region and branching outward.
That's super cool. All right, guys. I think we got to pack it up. Sorry if that's abrupt. But I'm looking at the clock, and I want to make sure that we hop off with enough memory on my computer to save the call. Just because I'm new, I'm getting paranoid. I want to thank you both so much for your, like, thoughtful preparation, your thoughtful responses, your willingness to just be in gray areas and be really vulnerable with your thoughts on your processes. I feel really lucky to be able to give anybody who listens to this information from you both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Jen.
This was really cool. It's your brainchild. I'm just, like, riding your wave, girl.
Well, you know, I did a poll or I asked people, you know, I had a post up. I was like, superwash has its place. And, like, a lot of people in my DMs were like, does it have to? And I appreciated that people were, like, not going to come for me in the comments. They were going to, like, quietly
come for you privately,
try and have a engaging conversation with me. Yeah, and so I knew that there was going to be a big appetite for this, but I knew that I was not equipped to bring it. So thanks for bringing it. Yeah. And you'll hear from us, everyone, about how to access the replay. I know some people trickled in, some people trickled out. Some people like to listen to things multiple times. We'll be in touch with how you can access it. And, you know, we have a lot of work rounding up everyone and everything we talked about if we decide to put together some notes.
Yeah.
But I know not everyone is an auditory information taker, so we'll try. Thanks. I'm going to close it up.
Thanks, Jen.
Bye all. Thank you.
Bye.